When looking at our lives, it's hard to imagine that things were any different. Humans have been living in houses and cities for centuries, and we seem to have got it down to a very fine art. Sure, we accept that our modern way of living is a relatively new occurrence. We don't, after all, live in wattle and dub roundhouses anymore, where our only source of heat was a small fire in the centre of the house, and the only way of getting rid of that smoke was to cut a circular hole in the roof. However, in the grand scheme of things, living this way is actually a relatively new way of living. Modern humans evolved somewhere around 200,000 years ago, and in that time we've only been settled in cities for little more than 11,000 years. What caused us to break from what seemed to have been the norm? And where did we first settle? Sufficient to say, a majority of the time humans have existed, it hasn't really been beneficial for humans to stay in one place. Remember, we as a species evolved during a time of great climatic change. We popped into existence during a time when ice ages were fairly common. As a result of us not inventing the portable heater, we would have to migrate from warmer climates whenever it began to get a tad bit chilly. The cold wasn't just the only reason. Early humans were, after all, hunter-gatherers. Hunting involves killing animals, and funnily enough, animals get cold too, so they too migrate to warmer climates. However, things on this planet hardly ever stay the same. Gradually, the long winters began to be, well, less long, and all of a sudden there were now areas which hardly had any noteworthy winter at all. Rather than migrating, small collections of hunter-gatherers began to stay in places which were abundant with game and food. The Ice Age had ended and the Neolithic had begun. One particularly interesting Neolithic site is in southeastern Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, which has been dated to around 9500 BC. From the evidence at this site, it is clear that this wasn't exactly a permanent site yet. However, this site is important for one very special reason. Göbekli Tepe is actually primarily regarded as being the world's first place of worship. There are several stone circles covering 25 acres, containing limestone pillars with animals, insects and birds carved into them. What's more amazing is that Göbekli Tepe and other sites in the area similar to it were all constructed using stone tools, and the pillars clearly took a small army of people to make. This was organisation unlike anything the world had seen before, and it seemed to have just been the start. Having mastered construction, the next trait for the human race to unlock was farming. Humans had begun experimenting with the concept of growing things. In 2006, archaeologists made an amazing discovery. Digging up an ancient Neolithic house in Jericho, archaeologists discovered the remains of figs. Now, finding these figs was extremely important. You see, figs, unlike a majority of plants and trees, cannot be pollinated by insects. As a result, the trees can only reproduce from cuttings. Finding figs in this Neolithic home seems to confirm that humans had cracked the formula for growing plants. Humans, however, weren't just growing figs. All around the region would become known as the Fertile Crescent. Small little communities of hunter-gatherers began to plant and harvest grain. Suddenly, one bright spark realised that if they could grow the food, then they could raise the animals that eat the food, and then eat the animals. As a result, humans began herding tameable animals and feeding them the crops they were growing. Suddenly, the need to migrate with their prey seemed obsolete. People were beginning to settle down permanently. These small collections of people began to grow in size, so much so that people began to play around with the new ideas of building structures that could support the growing populations, and also keep their newfound farm animals inside, and anyone wanting to steal their animals out. The Neolithic people needed a new, sturdier way of making their homes, and in Jericho they seem to have thought of how to solve this problem first. The Neolithic inhabitants of Jericho, which was founded in 9000 BC, started building their homes out of a revolutionary material. Most importantly, moulding mud into cuboid shapes which could then be stacked on top of each other to create sturdier walls. These new mud bricks were a revolution, allowing the inhabitants of Jericho to quickly build a unique little village. Jericho had a state-of-the-art stone wall and even a modest stone tower. This wall had a dual purpose of serving as protection from outside threats, humans or animal, whilst also keeping the inhabitants' newly domesticated animals penned in. There's even some evidence that the inhabitants of Jericho had actually began stockpiling food reserves, thus proving that these people had firmly decided to stay put. As a result of this decision, Jericho is largely regarded as being the first human urban centre. A little bit to the east of Jericho was the mighty rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. In between these rivers was a fertile stretch of land where plants and animals thrived. As a result, this was a particularly appealing spot for the newly settled humans to colonise. This region became known as Sumer, with its inhabitants being known as the Sumerians. There is some debate for where the Sumerians actually came from, but their contribution to human history overshadows their actual origins, and they set humanity on a course for world domination. A lot had changed for humanity in a very short amount of time. Within a matter of centuries, we had gone from primitive hunter-gatherers, barely surviving the climatic changes between ice ages and warm periods, to, within a matter of decades, putting down roots. Humanity was now growing their own food, and clusters of people were slowly beginning to come together, attracted by the notion of not having to migrate with their prey, and the seemingly simpler and safer life of living together in communities.
Thanks for watching and listening to our video. If you like the channel, consider subscribing to Ancient History Guy. Or, if you really like the channel, head on over to our Patreon feed. There, for as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to exclusive documentaries, behind-the-scenes footage, and videos before they're live on YouTube. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe.